Hi everyone, hope that lunch was good. It's keeping you awake. Awesome. So I'm probably the only non-technical speaker today, so hi everyone. I'm not a coder, and they are with me. Be nice. And no one's listening to me, so. There you go. All right, cool. So today I'm going to be speaking about sustaining open source, different ideas around that, and hopefully it's going to be controversial, which is what talks should be. So when my partner in crime, Xavier, started Storify back in the day in 2010, he decided to build it entirely on Node.js. Node.js was in its infancy. And Storify was one of the first large-scale consumer websites built entirely in JavaScript. So the development team at Storify was very happy with Node.js, and they wanted to give them money. And he wanted to support the development of Node.js, but he ran into a small issue. He didn't have where to send the money, or to whom. So why isn't there a back this project button on GitHub? And luckily, we are not the only ones thinking about this. So this was a tweet that on my feed recently says, if GitHub added the ability to sell support plans or priority issues, then I believe companies would pay for them. I believe that too. But the problem is that there is not such button on GitHub. And why isn't there one? It's because it's freaking complicated. We can make a project popular, we can start it, but we can't make it sustainable. We can't give them funding. An open source project is a community. It's a community of people around the world hacking together. That's pretty much it. They're not incorporated anywhere. And they don't have a legal entity, they don't have a bank account, and so they can't collect money. And that's a bit of an issue. So yes, some repositories receive money to the personal account of the author, but the problem is that most of the time money ends up in a black box, and the community doesn't really have a lot of visibility about where the money is going. So we can trust that the maintainer is going to show how they're spending the money, but it's a lot of trouble to do that on top of their open source work. It's like asking a little bit too much. People really would rather focus on their craft, on their code. So essentially asking our open source projects, asking what I call the associations of the internet generation to create a command and control structure in order to receive funding, it's pretty much the same as asking who's the president of the internet. There is no president of the internet. There's no president of an open source project. And for an open source project to be sustainable, they need to create an entity that has a president. That's a problem. Hacking together is phenomenal, but to go beyond that, to make a project into an organization, having a legal entity, having a president, having a director, it's blocking all of these projects to give that step, or at least the vast majority of them. Not only asking our generation to create command and control hierarchical structures ridiculous and out of sync with who we are and how we operate, but it's also extremely inefficient. I bet it happened to most of us here when they think about how they can make a living from their open source work, or try to sustain an open source project without completely burning out in the process. How do you do it? Do you do an LLC, a C Corp? Where do you do it? An open source project is more often than not people from all over the world hacking together. They don't even know each other. They've never met face to face. What are they gonna, incorporate? How do you bring together such a group of people into one place? And if you decide to do it, then you need to start thinking, well, okay, so we're an open source project. We figured this out. We're going to do a C Corp or an LLC or the equivalent anywhere. And the next thing that you're going to start thinking is, what's the minimum accounting services that you need? How much are you going to be paying on legal fees? Who's going to be taking responsibility in the name of the community? Are we even going to be able to raise the money to pay for our operation costs? Who's going to be able to withdraw money from where? And this not only happens to open source projects, it happens to all the communities that were born with the internet. And the problem that we have, this situation where we are completely out of sync with our system, it's because the system is optimized for corporations that compete in a scarcity-driven economy. Our economic system is built like that. But our generation, we want to work together. We want to collaborate. We do things in the open. We don't see the world as a zero-sum game anymore. We want to share. We want to learn from one another. And so what happens is that we end up being circles in a world made for triangles. In a world that speaks corporations, we are pushed to the fringes. Open source projects especially suffer from this because they're highly decentralized and they lack a common way of funding themselves. There is no, so if you, for example, have a research project, you can have an endowment from a university. Your open source projects are not really non-profit, but some of them are. So it doesn't really fit any of the categories that our system is providing. And that is bringing a lot of problems. Open source projects are not localized. They're not in one place. So it's highly unlikely that a government is going to take on the task of funding common digital infrastructure. Again, it's the tragedy of the commons. Who's going to do it? Right? If we are serving anyone, open source projects are useful to anyone. It's very unlikely that our governments in our nation states' little frameworks are going to start funding them. So while corporations are allowed to operate around the world, open source projects, networks of people that are building the technology that supports those corporations are extremely constrained. And I find that very, very unfair. And I don't think it's sustainable at all. Before I keep going, let's address the elephant in the room, money in open source. Money in open source is a hairy issue. And I know that I'm making a massive assumption here, talking about money in open source. You have no idea the conversations that I had since I started Open Collective. But like Tobias, it's the author of Webpack, I think he said it really, really well. Open source software is not free. Someone else is paying for it. And more often than not, that's all of you paying with your own time. It's maintainers paying with their time, with time that could be spent with their families, with time that could be spent in another way. So it's not free, it's just accessible. So must all open source projects be sustained? Well, maybe not. Is it okay for some open source projects to just die? Well, yes. Should we pay for code? I don't know, depends, right? What is the stage of the project? Like, all of these answers involve thinking about the stages of the project, the needs it has, the type of work the maintainers have to do, the dependencies the project has. It's not the same a project that has millions of dependencies than a project that is starting, or a very mature project that needs to be maintained. But what we try to do from Open Collective is kickstarting this conversation, at least assuming that paying for open source is not evil, and the conversation needs to be how we do it. How do we support open source projects? How do we make open source sustainable? So I do believe that open source projects are the building blocks of the majority of products, services, and digital infrastructure that we use today. And they're largely made by unpaid communities. Again, that's a huge, huge problem, because there's issues with not only with sustainability, but it's also issues with maintainer burnout. Is it okay to completely yell at a maintainer in Twitter because they're not patching an issue that you have, and you are, I don't know, a massive company? Are we okay with that? Um, Jason Miller from Preact said it, I think, also really well in an interview that we made not long ago. He says that we're all vulnerable to the trap of thinking that open source is free, and that's never true. There's always a cost, but as a maintainer, you only realize this once you're pretty far in. So in the open source sort of history, most companies had to be brought towards open source, convinced of using open source. But the problem is that once they did, oh man, they're hooked on open source. There's no going back, right? But the cost is being paid by communities and maintainers that often get all of this pressure from users, from companies. And again, there is no viable way of sustaining them, of giving them money. And like anything else, open source needs to become sustainable. So I do acknowledge that open source project will not be sustained exclusively by throwing money at the project, at the problem, sorry. There's many different ways that we can do this. But money does one thing really, really well. It removes friction. Right? So open source project, as anything, has a lot of friction, and money can help with that. This is, for example, the GitHub open source survey. So the #1 problem identified in open source is incomplete or confusing documentation. Money can help with this. Money can help really well in hiring a technical writer to write documentation, to respond to issues. Moderation and diversity are also at the roots of most of the problems identified in open source. Michael Rogers, in a very recent blog post, he talks about the community imbalance that happens in open source. And this is that it has a lot more users than people maintaining it. Like the buzz factor of many open source projects is frightening, right? And this is especially acute when you think about separating the roles of maintainers of open source projects and contributors of open source projects. It's not the same to contribute to a cool new feature than to do the hard work of maintaining a project, replying to issues, writing documentation, triaging, thinking about optimization, etc. So maybe money can pay for one set of work and not for the other. So money can reduce friction. Something else that you can do with money is you can invest in your community. So use funding to invest in your community. Open source collaboration can become a space for all types of contribution: time, code, expertise, and yes, also money. Spending in bringing people together face to face. Pay for one of the maintainers to go to a conference and talk about your project, about what you are doing. Funding can help with community building activities, such as sending contributors to conference, organizing meetups, or, as I was saying before, contracting a technical writer. Make better docs, make your project easier. I just saw this like a second ago on my feed and just quickly put it here. This is Andre. Andre is the author of Cycle.js. And Jan is one of the core maintainers. Jan was able to get paid really quickly for a feature, a framework work he did for Cycle.js on Open Collective, and he was able to replace his stolen laptop. So this is what I'm saying. Someone in your community has an issue, now you can help them. So I'm not talking about paying for code, I'm talking about investing in community, investing in the people that are making your open source project what it is. And make your open source project more friendly. If you are a maintainer of a very popular open source project and you're close to burnout, it's very difficult that you're going to reply well to issues or be very friendly. So if someone has the paid role of replying to issues, and this can be shared among different projects, then your project is going to be more friendly. So you can build, you can use money to make your project more open, more friendly, more diverse. And lastly, you can use funding to what we call free the maintainer. Not so long ago, we organized Sustain Open Source, a conference for sustaining open source, obviously. And one of the key takeaways from the conference was what we called free the maintainer. Maintainers often feel trapped by the projects that they created. The prospect of sustaining an open source project by turning it into a corporation only makes this harder, right? Because there's paperwork involved and there's ownership. And so when you don't know if your project will succeed, you're testing something, how long it's gonna last, how long you're gonna feel that you wanna work for it, how long you're gonna want to be involved in it. You don't want to bind yourself to a rigid legal entity, right? You need something that is flexible, that you can bring up and down. And that doesn't exist. That's an organizational structure that simply doesn't exist in the world. So how do we do this? The problem that we have is that economic systems is just not ready to deal with unincorporated groups of people that have a shared mission that want to have funding. We are shifting our economy, and the way we work is shifting towards a decentralized way of organizing. And our economic systems do not respond to these new behaviors. So how can we leverage our open source work if we have no infrastructure to support it? How can we think about ways of making money? So say we made the decision that we do want money. How can we get it if we don't have a bucket where to put it? And that's why we created Open Collective. Open Collective, that's a company that I co-founded. What brings about is a new social and economic unit in the world that we called Open Collectives. And it's a community of people that operates in full transparency, that has a shared mission in the world and operates in full transparency. Being able to create an organizational structure to support your own project needs to be as easy as creating a GitHub repository. Going through the paperwork of taking 6 months to create an organizational structure and talk about equity with the peers, with your peers, it's blocking a lot of projects. So the internet solved extremely well the problem of how can we collaborate at scale. But when it comes to giving these collectives a viable financial mechanism and a sustainable organizational structure, we're back talking to lawyers and accountants. Look, I have nothing special against lawyers and accountants, but it's really hard to argue that's where we should put the focus, right? We're building technology. We have a mission. We're building great things. Like, really talking to lawyers and accountants is not what you want to be doing, and that's fine. So having one legal entity per community is, in my mind at least, having one server per blog. Everyone keeps doing the same repetitive work, and we can't share the benefits. Imagine, everyone has to go file with the tax service, hire a lawyer, deal with the IRS, set up a bank. You know, half of you are asleep already. And look, I feel you. I do this for Open Collective, and I want to kill myself in the process. Well, what we do is we remove all of this friction for open source projects, but we absorb it. Thank you, later. It's hard work, and it's unrealistic to expect that every open source project out there is going to have their own legal entity to support themselves. There is no benefit in doing that. So what we need is an operating system that is transparent by design, and where we can all learn from each other and mutualize resources. We can share resources. We can share these technical roles like accountants and lawyers and technical writers and product managers. We can share it among different open source projects. And so it's way more efficient, and the open source developers can focus on their craft. So that's Open Collective, essentially. That's our contribution to the problem of how we solve collaboration at scale that uses money, right? Open Collective is an open source tool, obviously, for transparent finances. We enable communities like open source projects, but also transnational social movements, global political parties, the associations of our generation, to receive donations, mobilize volunteers, mutualize activities like fiscal sponsorship, bookkeeping, fundraising. So our platform, essentially what we do is we streamline the process of what is called fiscal sponsorship. So we set up virtual associations for these communities, these open collectives, so they can start raising funds and spend them transparently without having to set up their own legal entity or bank account. We create a dedicated page for everyone, and we keep track of the budget transparently. We produce an open, transparent ledger. In open source, I'm super proud to say that we've raised over $500,000 for open source projects across 292 collectives. Yeah, I know. Thank you. That's a lot of money. So in there, it's a mixed bag. There are some projects like Webpack that have an annual budget on Open Collective of over $200,000, and a lot of open source projects that don't have a budget at all. There are open source projects that they only need a couple of $100 to pay for their costs, for their servers. There are projects that are using funding for example, small things like selling stickers. And yes, when you start an open source project, you're going to say, like, you know what, I'm going to pay for the stickers, it doesn't matter. But everything, or I'll pay for the services, everything kind of adds up. And the pressure that most of my open source maintainers already have, adding financial pressure is not helping the problem. So Open Collective is transparent by design. Anyone can see the inner workings of a collective at any single time, how the money is going in, who's supporting an open source project, and how that money is being spent. Anyone can emerge as a leader of an open collective. If a core contributor wants to go off and do something else, there's not a massive organizational crisis, there's no paperwork to be signed, they just stop contributing, and someone else steps up, and they become the core contributor. The same thing that happens with open source, the repositories, is happening here with legal entities. And that's exactly what we were aiming for. So how it works, essentially this level of transparency is what enables existing organizations to virtualize their entities and become hosts. In our world, the hosts are the organizations that essentially virtualize their bank account, their entities, and they can host multiple different collectives. This enables them to do what they do what they love, and not worry about how they're going to be, where they're going to be receiving funding. This is, for me, super important. 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, Evan from Vue decided to join Open Collective. I don't know if you know about this, but Evan has been getting paid for his open source work for a while now on Patreon, but that was his work as a maintainer. People were paying him personally. And what he felt was that what was lacking was a community budget, a budget that the whole community behind Vue.js could use. And so they opened a collective very recently. They already have $11,000 there, which is great. And they're using it to fund things for the community. They're paying for stickers, they're organizing events, etc. So host organizations are like the web browser. Essentially what we're doing is we are removing the friction of dealing with a clunky and old operating system that is the operating system that the nation states produce for everyone else, which sounds great, but it's not so much fun when you have to do, when you absorb all this friction yourself. So open collectives can now, for example, sell swag, sell t-shirts, with the earnings going to their collective, right? Before, if you sold t-shirts for your project because you wanted to support your project, you had to put your own bank account. And in an open source project that it's a bunch of people that they may not know each other personally, there's a lot of trust that needs to happen for someone to receive money in the name of their community in their own bank account. So we removed that friction. We can now receive grants for a collective. So we just received a grant for Babel from Summer of Code from Google, that before, they had to send it to Henry, and Henry didn't want to receive that money. He didn't want to be responsible for that. So now the Google paid Babel's Open Collective, and the money is being used by the whole community. You can sell, for example, premium support, right? Being an open source project. This is how Webpack is mostly being financed at the moment. They have sponsorship tiers in exchange for office hours, or in-house training for companies. So if a company gets a sponsorship of, say, I don't know, whatever, $500 a month, they get X amount of premium support, right? So we're enabling open source projects to act as real organizations. But we needed to build that infrastructure before, because it didn't exist. Something else that you can do is, like, you can, for example, place ethical advertisement ads on your website. Again, the money will go straight to your collective, right? Instead of to one of the maintainers' bank account, and so on and so forth. And the beauty of it is this is not only for open source. It works for any community, any association. I believe that the associations of the internet generation, the associations that we build, the projects that we love and that we work for, are defined by peer production, by global communities, transparent money flows, and the obsolescence of hierarchy. None of this can fit in what the system today provides. So Open Collective builds like that kind of that layer where open collectives, on top of which open collectives can get supported and get funding for. This has nothing to do with open source, but it drove me crazy, so I want to leave this with you. This was a problem that ProPublica, a blog post that they published very recently about the Red Cross and Hurricane Harvey in the US. The Red Cross, they don't want to disclose how they use the funds for Sandy, for example. They say that it's a trade secret, right? And this is our money that should go for relief efforts. And there's no transparency about it. We have absolutely no idea how this money is being spent. So the new operating system that we need to build needs to be transparent by design. This can't happen anymore. The associations that we start, they're going to be transparent from the beginning. So this is obviously a big experiment. We are, playing around with this, how we unlock mass collaboration at scale for decentralized communities that want to use money is still in its very infancy, and we are still forced to work within current constraints. But what I know for sure is that the future will be definitely defined by people that take action and share costs and resources and work together. And I believe that the only way of pushing the boundaries of what's doable in the world is by building a new model that renders the old model obsolete. Or, as I learned when I was doing politics in Argentina, but that's for another talk, if you can't beat them, just abstract them and move on. Thank you, guys.